Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to welcome you back to the virtual reading group. We are continuing, just beginning really, but in the first chapter of reading this beaten up copy of Hannah Arendt's Between Past and Future. We read the prologue last week, which is really an extraordinary text. So if you happen to miss it or something, I encourage you to go back and catch it either on the YouTube page or on the podcast, which dropped today. Also, I just want to remind us all that the Hannah Arendt Center Conference on Tribalism and Cosmopolitanism is happening October 17th and 18th. And we usually have a great representation of people from the virtual reading group there and sometimes have little reunions there. So I hope some of you will make arrangements to join us. Look forward to it. It's going to be a great conference. So today we're reading chapter 1, Tradition and the Modern Age. As I mentioned last week, the book is really divided up into 3 parts. The first 2 essays, Tradition and the Modern Age and The Concept of History, are really about this overarching idea called the break in tradition. Then there'll be a second part on freedom and authority, which are about 2 of the most important consequences of the break in tradition, the loss of authority and the loss or transformation of freedom. And then the third part are these series of readings of different contemporary issues, education, culture, science, and truth and politics, and looking at how we can teach ourselves to think in this unique situation of the break of tradition and the end of our Western tradition. And so all 8 essays, she says, are importantly ways in which we become familiar with. They're examples of how to think amidst the break in tradition. But these first 2 essays have the sort of double task of convincing us that there is this break in tradition, or explaining to us what this break in tradition is. And I will say they're 2 of the more dense of all of Arendt's essays. I don't think you'll find any of her other essays in this book or in other places that are as sometimes caught up in a philosophical tradition as these are. And that makes them, I think, potentially quite interesting. They show a different side of Arendt, but also sometimes difficult. And so I'm gonna do my best to make them accessible, but also to make them make sense. So this first essay, Tradition and the Modern Age, let's just start with the title, right? Tradition is a key term here in this whole book. It literally means from Latin to carry over. It's a carrying over of the past into the present. The first consciously traditional society, she thinks, are the Romans, insofar as they take Greek philosophy and Greek culture and they make it their own. They see it as their tradition that they carry over into their present, but then make it their own. The second consciously traditional period in Western history is the Romantic and then Renaissance periods, where the Romantics look back on the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Renaissance seek to rebirth that tradition. So when we have an essay called Tradition and the Modern Age, we're talking about that tradition, that carrying over of a certain culture and philosophy and way of thinking and approach to the world that began long ago, at least in the Western tradition with the Greeks, was carried over by the Romans, was largely became second nature throughout much of the Middle Ages and the Roman Republic. Then maybe was challenged during the Enlightenment, and then was rebirthed during the Romantic period and then the Renaissance. And then she's going to say, was finally broken in an irrevocable way in the 20th century, largely with the events of Nazi Bolshevism. Nazi racism and anti-Semitism and totalitarianism and Bolshevik uh, racism or classism and totalitarianism. Those two events, she thinks, are the break of the Western tradition. At the same point, the essay is called Tradition and the Modern Age, not Tradition and the Modern World. And this is a distinction that Arendt is utterly consistent about, but almost nobody pays attention to, right? If you're an Arendt scholar, and, again, we're not all Arendt scholars, so it's not that important, but it's an important distinction for us to understand the text, right? The modern world, which is the world that it comes to exist after World War I and World War II, is introduced by the atom bomb and totalitarian domination as established facts that she says break the continuity of Occidental or Western history. That's on page 26 of this text. The modern world is this world of the broken tradition. And it's largely a world that comes about because of the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century. She says that this modern world was the result of no one's deliberate choice, and it's not subject to further decision. It's gone. The old world is gone. We now live in a new world, a world without the old tradition. But she distinguishes the modern world from the modern age. And so on page 26, she'll write the event, and by event here, she means the fact of totalitarian domination as the break in our tradition. So this event itself marks the division between the modern age, rising with the natural sciences in the 17th century and reaching its political climax in the revolutions of the 18th and unfolding in general implications after the Industrial Revolution of the 19th, and the world of the 20th century, which came into existence through the chain of catastrophes touched off by the First World War. So again, there's the modern age, which is beginning with natural sciences, and then the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, and then there's the modern world. So for those of you who are interested in Arendt, if you were interested and wanted to look further at this, go look back at the human condition. In the human condition on page 6, she'll say, however, the modern age is not the same as the modern world, right? And by the way, the human condition is written around the same time as this essay. The modern age is not the same as the modern world. Scientifically, the modern age, which began in the 17th century, came to an end at the beginning of the 20th century. Politically, the modern world in which we live today was born with the first atomic explosion. So just want to make sure we understand that, because if you don't understand that distinction, so much in this essay gets confused and gets lost. So on page 39 of this essay on tradition and the modern age, she'll write, since the rise of modern science, and thus the modern age, whose spirit is expressed in the Cartesian philosophy of doubt and mistrust, the conceptual framework of the tradition has not been secure, right? So since the modern age, the conceptual framework of our Western philosophical and political tradition has not been secure, but it hasn't been broken. It only breaks with the modern world and with the atom bomb and with totalitarianism. This essay there is largely about the modern age, not the modern world, right? That said, the essay takes place in 4 parts, and part 2 is largely about the modern world and not the modern age. And so you can get confused, and I understand that, and that's why I'm trying to emphasize this and warn you against that confusion. The 3 thinkers of the modern age, the thinkers that she's going to address in this essay, are Soren Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. She says these thinkers are going to be like guides and guideposts to the perplexities and the weakness and the fading of the modern of the tradition in the modern age. But they are not themselves indications of the break. The break only comes later in the 20th century after they're all dead. And thus she says that the thinkers of the modern age, Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche, are not responsible for totalitarianism or the break in tradition of the modern world, right? These 3 thinkers, she says, Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche, stand at the end of tradition just before the break came. That's on page 27. Their greatness, she says, on 27, lay in the fact that they perceive their world as one invaded by new problems and perplexities, which our tradition of thought was unable to cope with. So here's an important guide for us to understand. What made Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche great is that they saw that the fundamental concepts of the modern of our tradition no longer worked. They no longer explained the world we were living in. They no longer gave us an account of the world that was meaningful. And so they sought to struggle with that tradition. She says that they saw the tradition as dark and they were lost. They looked back at the tradition for guidance and they found that it gave no guidance to the modern world. But they didn't break with the tradition, she says. The tradition was simply silent to them and they fought against it, but they were still in it. Each one of these 3 thinkers tried to, in a sense, free themselves from the tradition, but in a way that still was caught up in that tradition. She says, for us, it's quite different, right? We don't stand where Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche stood. For us, the tradition is completely broken. It's not even just dark for us. It doesn't hold us at all, right? And so when the break came, again on 27, she says, the thunder of the eventual explosion has also drowned the preceding ominous silence that still answers us whenever we dare to ask not what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for? In other words, Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche knew what they were fighting against, and they were fighting against the tradition, but they were also trying to still preserve the tradition. They were still fighting for the tradition, but they were trying to reinvent it. She says, we don't even know what we're fighting for. We are so free from that tradition that it has no hold on us whatsoever. And thus we are completely lost from that. We live without a tradition, without a beginning, without a principle. We live amidst this break in tradition. That is not how Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche lived. For them, there was still a beginning. There was still a God of the beginning that saves all things. So on page 18, she quotes Plato from the Laws, who writes, the beginning is like a God, which as long as it dwells among men, saves all things. And what she means, what she takes from that is that as long as the beginning of the tradition is still visible, as long as you can even see it, even if it's no longer applicable, it still can provide a category. It still can provide a container for us to think within, a tradition that holds us. We can fight against it. We can seek to reinvent it, but it's there. As long as the tradition's beginning was alive, it could bring all things into harmony. Even Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Marx still were part of that tradition and thus could be harmonized with it. But today, that's no longer the case. The radicality of her insight here is that we are no longer able to save the tradition. We're no longer able to see the beginning. And we have to confront that radical break. And that's what these 8 essays are about, is how to begin to think amidst that radical break. Okay, that's the overarching. I hope that helps clarify where things are in this essay, what it's trying to do. A large part of the essay then is somewhat confused, going back and forth accounts of how Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche are 3 great thinkers struggling against tradition and the way they do it. The first one that she confronts, and the one that she probably spends the most time with in this text, is Karl Marx. She had been working in the 1950s when she wrote this on a long book on Karl Marx that she never ended up writing. But this is one of these essays in which some of that material from that book finds its way into publication. In this first long excursus on Karl Marx, from pages 21 to 25, the main point here is that the opposition of thinking and acting, right, that Marx brings into his philosophy, deprives thought of reality and deprives action of sense. It ends up losing both thought and action. It thus makes both thinking and action meaningless. So the origin here, the beginning that she keeps going back to, is Plato's analogy of the cave, in which, if those of you who remember it, a bunch of people are in a cave. They're fettered, and they're looking at a wall, and they think they see reality, but the reality is just shadows, because there's a fire behind them casting themselves and others as shadows on the wall. But they think that's reality. And then one of them frees themselves, turns around, right? And the famous word in the Platonic text that she makes so much of is periagoge, to turn oneself around and then walk up out of the cave and into the sun and into the light. Just like Plato's philosopher turned to the light of ideas against the shadows of reality, Marx turns away from the supersensible, the ideas, to the reality of truth in this world, in this society, a societalization or socialization of truth. So Marx inverts ourselves, stands Plato and Hegel on their heads, and comes back to the ground, not to the light of ideas. The problem is that, for our end, is that our tradition of political thought, right, which began with Plato when he turned around and went up into the world of ideas, when Marx brings it back down into the world of reality, Marx, when he leaps from philosophy to politics, right, turns around and brings it back, he can't escape philosophy, because when he returns from philosophy to politics, from the ideas to the material world, he brings philosophy down with him in the form of the dialectic, within the form of his philosophy of the progress of history towards a communist utopia. And thus, he brings the dialectics of action, which we today would call an ideology, into the real world. And so he doesn't free ourselves from ideas and philosophy. He just sort of makes ideology impure by actually mixing it up with the real world, and makes the real world conform to ideology in a way that rejects its own value. It must now conform to an ideology brought down from the sky. And so he superimposes, she says on page 29, the laws of history upon politics. And this destroys both thought and action, ideas and politics. When you turn away from the idea and to action, you don't have either ideas or action left. That's her fundamental critique of Marx, which carries through all of her writing on Marx in the 1950s into the 1960s. Part two of the essay, which I've already expressed in some way and explained in some way, because I think it's sort of it sets the core of what she's trying to do, is about the break in the modern world as opposed to the modern age. And she now contrasts these two. As I said before, this tradition that is broken in the modern world is not always a conscious tradition. Sometimes it's unconscious. Most of the time it's unconscious. But the times it's been conscious have been in the Roman times and in the Romantic and Renaissance ages. The end of the tradition, right, doesn't always mean that the tradition loses its power, right? It may be that the religious tradition of Christianity and Islam and Judaism and others has come to an end, but it still has power, right? It may not be as powerful as it once was, but there's still places it has quite a bit of power. And it can be a living force, and as the memory of its, even as the memory of its beginning recedes. And she says on page 25 to 26, traditions that are in recession may even reveal their full coercive force only after they have come to an end and men no longer even rebel against it. So these things can still be quite powerful. The actual break of tradition, as I said earlier, but she here emphasizes it, this is in part two, is not from Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche, but from the established fact of totalitarianism, which she talks about here in The Human Condition. She'll talk about the atom bomb. What Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche do, and where their greatness lies, is that they perceive their world as invaded by new problems which our tradition was unable to cope with. What frightened them was the darkness of the tradition, its silence, not a break. What frightens today, she says, is the silence not of tradition, but the silence when we ask, what are we fighting for? The fact that we are so fully divorced and cut off from the tradition and from any tradition that we simply don't know what we're fighting for. She says on page 28 that Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche are guideposts to a past which has lost all its authority over us. They dared to think without authority, right? They saw that the tradition was weakening. They saw that the tradition no longer answered the questions that needed to be answered, the modern questions. And so they thought anew. They thought without authority. But she says they were still within the categories of the tradition. They questioned the hierarchy, but still thought in those categories. And so she says that Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche, this is on 28, are for us like guideposts to a past which has lost its authority. They were the first who dared to think without the guidance of any authority whatsoever, right? They dared to think without authority. They dared to think and say, what can we do new? Yet, she says, for better or worse, they were still held by the categorical framework of the great tradition. In some respects, we are better off. Now, here's where she's going to transition to our age, our world. We need no longer be concerned with their scorn for the educated Philistines, who all through the 19th century tried to make up for the loss of authentic authority with a spurious glorification of culture, right? They were scornful of these Philistines, right, who put up artworks or went to museums and, knew that the old ideas of beauty and truth were sort of gone, but still tried to hold on to them because they didn't know what else to do. She says, we, right, have a new opportunity because we're so free from the tradition, and we're also free from the categories, that we can look upon the past with eyes undistracted by any tradition. And so we are somewhat better off than they were. The authority they rebelled against us, the authority they rebelled against is for us no longer even powerful enough to rebel against. We can just simply act anew. That's for her an advantage. We have a kind of freedom, but it's also, of course, a danger, because if we act fully anew without authority, well, we can do horrific things, right? And that's what the break of tradition really means. The break of the modern world, right? The fully loss of the tradition means that anything is possible, right? That's the epigraph to the totalitarianism section of the book on origins of totalitarianism. The third part of this essay is that these three rebellions against tradition by Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche all ended in a kind of self-defeat, right? They all rebelled against the tradition, but they couldn't escape it. They were caught in it. They experienced the loss of the tradition. They sought to find something new, but they couldn't. They were still caught in it. So Kierkegaard, right? And here's where she talks a little bit about all three of them, and I'll just do it briefly. Kierkegaard, who was interested in religion, was influenced by Descartes, that we must doubt everything. Well, religion is about faith or belief, and usually belief comes first. But Kierkegaard says, no, we start with doubt and we leap into belief. So we reverse the traditional relation of reason and faith. Tradition says reason leads to faith as its completion. Now, doubt leads to faith as a last recourse. The problem is that doubt is now brought fully into religion by Kierkegaard. He wanted to assert the dignity of faith against modern reason, but he starts with modern reason. The problem here, of course, is that once you start with modern reason and science, is that there's a conflict between a spirit of doubt and distrust, which can only trust what it is made, right? That's the Cartesian idea. And the traditional unquestioning confidence in what has been given, which is the traditional idea of faith. And so there's a attempt to reconcile these two, and yet it doesn't work. And she says that this defeat of Kierkegaard's is personified in the character Alyosha, right? Alyosha Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and in all of Dostoevsky's work, where the true Christian characters are simpletons, simple-minded people, because you can no longer be a thoughtful person and be a person of faith. And that's the self-defeating aspect of Kierkegaard's thought that she discovers or she finds. Similarly, for Marx, if Kierkegaard leapt from doubt to faith, Marx leaps from politics to philosophy. Instead of first having a philosophy like Plato that you find and you impose back on the world, Marx says, no, it's all material, but we have to leap into a politics, leap from politics into philosophy, and then back to politics. But when we do so, we carry this theory of dialectics back into action. And she says that's self-defeating because it makes action actually philosophical or theoretical, and thus ideological, and thus we lose the significance of both action and thought. And Nietzsche, right? In Nietzsche, we make a leap from the non-sensuous, bodily world of will to the idea, and I'm sorry, we leap from a non-sensuous idea world into a sensuous world of life. But if we abolish truth, we also abolish lies, because you can't have lies if there are no truths. And so again, there's a self-defeat. All three of these figures, Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche, she says, didn't want to be nihilists. They wanted to believe in something. But in the elevation of values over truths, where values are always relative, there was no highest value. That's what nihilism is. And they all, even though they struggled against nihilism, they all, in some sense, um, caught up were caught up in the problem, the inescapable problem of nihilism as the tradition which gave us non-relative values weakened. Um, and thus, she says, these three outstanding and conscious rebellions against a tradition which had lost its arche, or its beginning and principle, all ended in self-defeat. She says that doesn't mean they're not great. This is on page 30. They're still great. They showed the incompatibility of ideas, transcendent ideas and values, but they caught up in it and couldn't escape it. In part 4, she says that even beyond this self-defeating problem, the fact that all three of these thinkers, internal to their own thought, were self-defeating, the more radical problem is that all of them opposed abstractions of philosophy, truths, and beauty and ideas. And all three of them opposed the concept of man as a rational animal, as an animal rational. She says that each of their rebellions seems to be concentrated on the ever repeated subject against the alleged abstractions of philosophy and its concept of man as an animal rational. So Kierkegaard asserted that man is not a rational animal, he's a concrete suffering man. Marx asserts that man is not a rational animal, he's a laboring animal, consumed with productive life forces. And Nietzsche assumes that man is not a rational animal, that he's he's wills to power, and that he's a willing animal. And so what all three of them saw independently, and that's their greatness, is that the tradition of philosophy that would start with abstract ideas and start with man as a rational animal is broken. And they saw into the darkness of the tradition, and they were frightened and they rebelled against it. But they couldn't actually free themselves from it. And that's the very, and that was their dark place. Our place is even darker because we can't even see into the beginning of the tradition. It's so broken that we are completely lost. The terror of our times is this sort of absolute freedom to create whatever we might. And somehow she says we have to live in that new space of the broken tradition. Um, that's the sort of space she clears in this first chapter, which the rest of the essays, the next 7 essays, are going to build upon as exercises in learning how to think in that space. All right, so I'm going to stop there. This can be a pretty daunting essay, as I said, first because some of you probably don't know Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche all that well, and it's not it's an essay that somewhat requires, I think, a fair bit of philosophical background to make sense of it. But it's also daunting because it's depressing. But between those two things, I'm hoping we'll have a good and interesting discussion of it, and I look forward to talking about it with you. Um, uh, I would very much love it if our discussion really focused on explicating the text, just because it is a complicated text and it is so important for what comes next in the rest of the book. But we'll do what you guys want to do. You can, of course, talk to each other in the chat, and please be respectful. And you can also raise your hand under the reactions button and ask me a question, and I look forward to that. Greg, you're up first.
Hi, Roger. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm definitely sticking to the text. I read this chapter a number of times, and I always feel like I stand at the edge of actually understanding it, but I never quite get across the line. So I'll try to ask two questions as succinctly as I can. First is, can you just maybe reiterate why she thinks totalitarianism has broken the tradition? I just never had the sense that we were so free from this great Western tradition that she is referring to here. So that's one question. I just haven't seen that argument or understand it otherwise. And then the second question is there's like this notion that seems to be running through the text here, and maybe she makes it in other places too, this notion that without being there can be no appearance, and without appearance there can be no being, or without the realm of ideas there's no politics, and vice versa, that each kind of depend on the other. Um, if that's a correct summary of that idea, I mean, why do those two depend on each other the way that she seems to say they do?
Yeah, good.
Thanks.
Well, thanks, Greg. Yeah, those are excellent questions. So the first one, why is totalitarianism, or the atom bomb, right? These are two examples she gives, two events, markers of the break of tradition. Well, in the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the epigraph to the third section is, it's from David Rousset, and it goes in. I'm going to paraphrase it, but men did not know that anything was possible, right? The point is that when totalitarianism happened, it was, we had a tradition of 2,000 years where you had different forms of government. You'd had tyranny, you'd had monarchy, you'd had aristocracy, you'd had oligarchy, you'd had democracy, you'd had anarchism, but you never had uh, a government that sought to fully destroy human freedom. You'd never had a government that was completely aimed at replacing reality with a consensus fiction. Um, and and from her point of view, that that ability to completely replace reality with a consensus fiction, that ability to um uh completely eliminate human natality or human freedom, or the effort to do so, uh the idea of eliminating races of people, um was for her evidence that we had simply lost any of the ethical, moral, philosophical guideposts of our tradition. Um, and so once that happens, you can, after the war ends, you can try and come back to it, but you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And so from her point of view, we now live in a world in which the effort to completely rewrite reality and rewrite, what George Orwell, talked about in his book 1984, the effort to completely, in a total way, dominate an entire civilization and make them into your image, and maybe even scientifically through genetic manipulation, change them and make them serve, your purposes. These are now possibilities, newfound possibilities. And you can't stop that from being something people can think about and aspire to. And so she says the tradition, which is something that you carry over and provides us with a certain authority and has guideposts and pillars and things that, are you don't always, obviously the Christian tradition was honored more in the breach than in actually obeying the laws of God, or or the Jewish tradition or the Muslim tradition, but they were there as laws. And she says now those laws are optional, fully optional, and we can't stop that. And so we have to understand that we now live at a time when those laws are optional, and we have to not simply say you can't do that, because now we know you can do that and people have done it. And so that's what she means by how totalitarianism broke the tradition. It's an extraordinary and harrowing observation, but I think that's what she means by it. And I think she's sadly correct. The other question you asked about um um why why you can't have appearance without being, or you can't have lying without truth, uh is an insight that was um first discovered by Friedrich Nietzsche in in a 2-page tour de force of thinking called How the True World Became a Fable. Um, uh, and um, and then later, this was a text that Arendt's first teacher, Martin Heidegger, made a lot of. Um, but the basic insight here is that if the tradition says that there is a truth and what we have on earth is a appearance and not fully true, right? If there's a true idea of um, a table, we have all these tables, but none of them are the true table because they might be a little crooked or they may not work, but they are approximations of it, but they're not the real table. But you can't say, well, forget truth. We're just going to have the tables because you can't have a table without an idea of what a table is. Similarly with um, truth and lies. Uh, you know, if you say, well, there is no truth, um, how do you lie something? What is it even a lie? What does it mean to say there's a lie? And so what Nietzsche says is that if you actually destroy or take away the true world, you also take away the apparent world, because if there's no truth, you can't also have appearance. You need both to have you need each to have the other. Um, and in this case, you know, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Marx each rebelled against a kind of truth of that man is a rational animal. Let's just take that one as an easier case, I think, because that's one of the two she talks about. Um, Marx says man isn't a rational animal; he's a laboring animal, right? He's about um, making and building the world, and yet he can't just labor because he needs something to labor for. And so he brings these ideas in the historical dialectic down into the world. And Marx says he's laboring towards a utopia, but the utopia is caught up in the ideas, the true world. And so, what she's saying is that what Marx and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard understood, or not understood, Nietzsche understood, the others two struggled against it maybe without understanding it, is that you can't free yourself. Even if you invert the hierarchy, you're still caught up in it. And that's the argument there. Um, yeah, I hope that's helpful. Catherine Lee, right?
Yeah, that's me. Sorry for
Yeah.
locating you, but so the thing, and this I apologize if this is like sounds like so basic, but it's the question that I keep struggling with both last week and this week. It's the really basic one. Is she talks about tradition and just repeats tradition, tradition, tradition over and over again. And I understand that it's like the basis.
Catherine,
like
Catherine,
basis.
Catherine, I'm going to mute everyone and then unmute yourself again because there's someone else talking. So I'm just going to mute everyone and now unmute yourself again.
Sorry, my phone is annoying. So she keeps talking about tradition, and there's a part of me that keeps I keep vacillating between feeling like there's something about this that makes so much sense to me, and then at other times being really annoyed by her arguments because I'm just not sure that I buy any of it. What is the tradition? just really, really basically, because she keeps referring to it over and over again, but I'm not exactly sure what she's talking about in some ways.
Okay.
And I think part of the reason it's confusing to me, and that even though it sounds so much of her argument makes so much sense, I have a hard time buying that number one, before the sort of the Greeks and the Romans, there was tradition, or that we no longer buy it. Like, who is we? And and I'm thinking globally, there are sort of traditions of philosophy and understanding of the world in parts of the world that Arendt was never in, that aren't based in Western thought and things like that. So it's just a struggle to me because I feel like it's at once like really insightful and brilliant, but it also feels so like, is it really just sort of like the golden age of Western thought? And that's it, right? Because there's a part of me that's like, is that really it? Is that all that we're sort of confined in and by?
Okay,
So
thank you.
sorry if that's super basic,
No,
but it's
look,
just like clarifying that, like what is the tradition? Would
I
be really
love that.
helpful.
I love that question. I think it's exceptionally insightful and important. And I bet almost everyone on this call is saying thank you for asking it, or if they hadn't realized it, they're now thanking you for asking it. What is tradition? Uh, Not an easy question to answer. On the one hand, I gave you a sort of grammatical or etymological definition of it, right? Traditio, a carrying over. Um, uh, she says at the very beginning of this essay, right? Our tradition of political thought had its definite beginning in the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. It came to its no less definite end in the theories of Karl Marx. So, one tradition, right? Our tradition of political thought, uh, is the tradition from Plato and Aristotle to Marx. Um, it's a tradition in which Plato and Aristotle tell us that there is um, uh, a science of politics, right? In Aristotle's terms, in Plato's terms, that um, uh, there is a truth of ideas, and that truth should be used to govern the political world through the philosopher king. Um, and She thinks that that's one tradition of ours, and it's the tradition of Western political thought, and we could trace it through. But that's not the only tradition. And when she's talking about tradition in the modern age, she's talking more broadly about a number of traditions. Back in the prologue, which we read last week, right on page 13, um, she talks about the need to settle down in this gap between past and future, which she calls the activity of thinking. And she says, for a very long time in our history, actually throughout the thousands of years that followed upon the foundation of Rome and were determined by Roman concepts, this gap was bridged over by what, since the Romans, we have called tradition. That this tradition has worn thinner and thinner as the modern age progressed is a secret to nobody, right? Well, okay, what is that tradition? Well, in part 2 of this essay that we read for today, Tradition in the Modern Age, right? She says that before the Romans, such a thing as tradition was unknown, right? With them, it became, and after them, it remained the guiding thread through the past and the chain to which each new generation, knowingly or unknowingly, was bound in its understanding of the world and its own experience, right? Now, there were traditions before the Romans, but they weren't known as traditions. The Romans were the first people in her reading. I'm not going to say she's right about this. I don't know. Um, uh, that explicitly saw themselves as a traditional people, namely that they built up these ways of thought and these habits and these rituals and these ideas that were supposed to guide us like a guiding thread and connect us to the past. So the Romans said, um, uh, we are guided by, well, what? Um, uh, Romulus, right? And Remus. So the king and the priest. And the Roman religion and the Roman kingship are our guiding traditions. And then Christianity comes in and Romans incorporate it into their religion. and Christianity becomes a guiding post of the Roman faith and the Roman politics, which had already incorporated the Greeks. And when they brought new people into the Roman Republic, incorporated them too. But the point is that they had a beginning, they had a sense of the beginning, and they tried to keep that beginning. And every time they brought something new into it, they tried to tie it together into this thread. In the essay, What is Authority, which we'll spend a fair bit of time on because I think it's one of the most important essays in this book, she'll talk about the Trinity, right? The Trinity of religion, the past, and tradition and family as sort of the core of the Roman idea of this guiding thread. So what is tradition? Great question. There are a lot of traditions out there, but it's this fundamental idea that all sorts of new ideas can be brought into our culture, but they are incorporated into the beginning, incorporated into the fundamental ideas of our tradition, and thus we're not absolutely free. They're because we are a people who start with Remus and Romulus. We are a people who start with the Christian Trinity. We are a people who start with these fundamental ideas from our past. And we are caught up in that past. Most of the time, and most of us, we never think about it. We just live that way. But some of us, some thinkers, not only critique that tradition and past, but try and free ourselves from it. But we free ourselves from it while still remaining in it, and thus it changes and it evolves. But we're still in that tradition until the modern world, when that tradition breaks. That's her argument. So I hope that that helps. It's a great question. Almost every single one of the essays in this book will engage this question of tradition, because that's what this book is about, is how to think amidst the break in tradition. And so we'll keep coming back to it, and I hope it gets a little clearer. Does that help? I mean, honestly, this is a big question. And it's an important question. So if there's something specific you'd like to ask as a follow-up, I'll take it.
No, I mean, I think it does help. And I think to me, it continues to be the struggle of my read, which is that, which is maybe different than hers, is that so many of us actually live both continuing in a thread of tradition, but aware that not everybody does. Like that, maybe that to me that's maybe a more distinction of the modern age, because I think there are lots of people who believe that they live and try to live within a thread of tradition,
right? So
but are aware of the breaking of it around us.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. And I mentioned that in my introduction. She says on the bottom of page 25, right? The end of a tradition does not necessarily mean that traditional concepts have lost their power over the minds of men, right? Just because these traditions have broken doesn't mean that we don't. Some people still very much caught up in them. On the contrary, it sometimes seems that this power of well-worn notions and categories becomes more tyrannical as the tradition loses its living force and as the memory of its beginning recedes. It may even reveal its full coercive force only after its end has come and men no longer even rebel against it. This at least seems to be the lesson of the 20th century aftermath of formalistic and compulsory thinking, which came after Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche had challenged the basic assumptions of traditional religion, traditional political thought, and traditional metaphysics by consciously inverting the traditional hierarchy of concepts. However, neither the 20th century aftermath nor the 19th century rebellion against the tradition actually caused the break. So what she's saying here is, even that, the rebellion against tradition in Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Marx didn't cause the break. But once it broke, that doesn't mean that the concepts and the categories of the tradition simply disappear. They're there. And some people, amidst this terror of the freedom, hold on to the tradition ever more strongly. But since the tradition is broken, the only way they can hold on to the tradition more strongly is through violence. The only way they can hold on to the tradition is by violently imposing it upon either themselves or other people, because it's no longer an authoritative tradition. It's broken. And so it can still exist as an act, as something that some people embrace through violence. But as a tradition, it's broken. Okay. I think that maybe those two.
No, it's really helpful. Thanks.
John.
Thanks, Roger. And the violence that comes from a broken tradition is what Marx was emphasizing. Anyway, my question has to do with the paragraph that begins at the bottom of page 36 and goes over to page 37, where she talks about Plato.
John, before you go on, can I just say I don't think the violence of the broken tradition is what Marx was emphasizing. Marx's embrace of violence is something different. Marx's embrace of violence is that in order to bring about the new world we want, out of a world of entry that is not ready to get there, we may need to use violence rather than persuasion. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. But now we'll move on. Okay.
Yeah, well, all right. My point was that the persuasion is no longer effective because there's no authority.
Right, but the violence for Marx can be progressive. It doesn't need to be going back to an old tradition.
Okay, well, that wasn't my main point.
Okay.
Anyway, but her discussion of Plato and what she calls his violent polemics against Homer. Now, Homer represented, we can call it a tradition, but it certainly was the basis of Greek culture that Plato strenuously opposed. And it's the parable of the cave is in reaction to the Hades, or the underworld, in Book 11 of the Odyssey. So anyway, Nietzsche picked this up in his first book, Birth of Tragedy, where he complains about Socrates and his rational approach to human life, rather than the intuitive or sensuous approach that Homer brings. My question is this, and that's not something I quite fully understand. About 2/3 to the bottom of page 37, she says it was solely for political purposes that Plato set forth his doctrine of ideas in the form of a reversal of Homer. I don't quite understand that.
Are you on 37 or 36? I'm just
37, about 15 lines from the bottom of page 37. It was solely for political purposes that Plato set forth his doctrine of ideas in the form of a reversal of Homer.
Yeah.
And my interpretation of that is that the tradition that we're talking about and that Plato started is the political tradition, which is a self-conscious attempt to understand human relationships. Self-conscious and rational, as opposed to the Homeric approach, which is based on narrative rather than dialectics or reason.
Yeah. Okay. So that's on the top of 37 in my book. I think we might have slightly different editions, so I apologize.
No.
So what you're asking, it's a good point. This is an important point you're bringing up about Plato's inversion of Homer, just like later Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche try and invert Homer. But you're asking why it's a political purpose? Is that the question you're asking?
Yeah, she says it was solely for political purposes that Plato set forth his doctrine of ideas. I'm trying to understand that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, his doctrine of ideas in the form of a reversal of Homer. I mean, I think, uh, um,
I mean, I know Nietzsche's response to that. Nietzsche was upset because what Socrates is doing, and it's not so much against Plato as it is against Socrates or Socratism, which is to look at the world around us solely through rational thought, rather than through more sensuous or experiential approach, through a tradition that is not self-consciously rational. It's through narrative rather than through dialectical reason. And one of the reasons why I'm concerned about it is that today's radical right theorists, like Patrick Deneen, seem to be wanting to go back to a more Homeric approach. And I think that's what was behind Nazi ideology, namely myth. Myth should rule us rather than thought or narrative. And narrative hits at the gut rather than at the head.
right. I mean, I think it's a great point, John. I'd have to, I mean, I'd have to do a little more work to fully understand the Homeric. I mean, basically, I mean, you're asking what was Plato's political response to Homer. Um, and what she says on a little before where you quoted, so it's on 36 in my version. It's in the same paragraph. The reversal of the Homeric position is obvious. It is as though Plato were saying to him, not the life of bodiless souls, right, in Hades, but the life of the bodies takes place in an underworld. Compared to the sky and the sun, the earth is like Hades. Images and shadows are the objects of bodily senses, not the surroundings of bodiless souls. In a sense, Plato's Periagoge is turning around, by which everything was commonly believed in Greece, in accordance with the Homeric religion, came to stand on its head. It is though the underworld of Hades had risen. So I guess the political, right? As you said, the solely political point is that for the Greeks of Homer, what mattered was the world of bodies and the world of action.
Mm-hmm.
And then the problem with the world of bodies and the world of action, as Plato saw it, is that it led to things like the trial and death of Socrates,
Mm-hmm.
because it led to um, uh, thoughtless people running the world. And so Plato, in his politics, wanted to impose a kind of order or truth or certainty on politics. And so he had to turn away from uh, the things of this world to a world of ideas, right? Which could then be used to provide a truth or a standard against which the things of this world would be judged, to prevent those kind of democratic excesses. And I take it to be that that's the reason she says that it was solely for political purposes that Plato set forth his doctrine of ideas as a reversal of Homer. That's the best I can do
Okay.
on a short notice. Okay.
Thanks.
Yep.
May I jump in, Professor Roger?
Yeah. Is that Clara? Who is that? Clara?
Yes. Hello, how are you, Professor Roger? Okay, so I just want to say that your argumentation in this case is not convincing. I mean, from my point of view, just a short comment, Professor.
Do you want to say why or just say that?
I just want to think about why it's not convincing, but at the first view, it's not convincing. I think it's like a kind of making up things.
Okay. I mean, like I said, I haven't, I mean, I think that there's something right about what I said, right? Which is that Plato saw the danger of the Greek world in its in its in its elevation of doxa, opinion, over truth, and that he sees Homer's portrayal of the underworld with these bodiless souls as a kind of as a kind of portrayal of Greek political life, in which there's no truth, and he tries to invert that, and I think that is what he's trying to do in the Republic. I'm not trying. I'm not giving here a full reading of Plato and Homer. I don't have the time or right now the expertise to do so. But you know, and if it's not convincing, I you know, all I can say is well, we'll try and do better. I don't have it down. Okay, Vigdis.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first is related to the end of the answer to one of the other who asked and about tradition, and that's what she says. The end of tradition does not necessarily mean that traditional concepts have lost their power over the minds of men. On the contrary, it sometimes seems that this power of well-worn notions and categories become more tyrannical as the tradition loses its living forces and the memory of its beginning recedes. And I relate this to what she says in the preface, that the key words of political language has lost their original spirits and has left us with empty shells. And to me, this is, and I wonder if you agree on this, it relates to two other places where she talks about this kind of where language has lost the relation to the world we live in. One is in The Life of the Mind, where she quotes Wittgenstein, where he says philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And she comments on that. The trouble is, of course, that this battle can be fought again only by means of language. And the other is in Denktagebuch, where she writes that the need to think arises wherever we find the words taken in their ordinary sense are obscuring rather than revealing. And the process of clarification that occurs in the thinking process comes about through distinctions. Because to me, this is kind of what goes again in much of her writing. It is a kind of the troubling when the words we use have lost their relation to the world. The second question is quite short, and this is a kind of trying to relate this to what she does in this book. And so we are experiencing a climate and a nature crisis that we see the Earth's resources are far from sustainably used. But are we caught in the conceptual or categorical framework of progress and growth? That is that kind of language where the constant progress thinking and the thinking of constant growth is actually something that doesn't fit the crisis we stand in today. So that's my two questions.
All right. On the first question, I think I just say I agree with you, and I think you've brought up some good other examples of the points we were making. So I appreciate that. I don't have much to add. The second question, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I mean, that's a question that's sort of to me beyond what I know. So I'll leave it. Can I leave it as a point? I'm not sure it was a question, or at least not a question that I understand to answer. So
yes, that's perfectly okay. It's my thinking from the kind of a language that doesn't fit any longer, or a framework we kind of think within, or at least politicians think within, that doesn't any longer fit the crisis we stand over today.
Okay, good. I'll leave it then as a comment. That's perfectly great. Thank you. Jerry.
Roger, I'd like to try to bring this talk, what we're talking about, little bit down to earth. This actually was in the heyday of Arendt's turning away from philosophy. It's not perhaps where she ended up, but it's where she was when she wrote these essays. Hannah loved giving dinner parties. They were very important to her. She thought a lot about them and she enjoyed them. I like to think of this essay as a dinner party. There was a book written some time ago by Carl van Vechten about impossible dinner parties where people who couldn't have been together in ordinary time were having dinner together. And I like to think of this, I mean, after all, there would be a dinner party of four, there would be three Germans and one very witty Dane. And I think that if we could imagine that dinner party, we would imagine them, all four of them. They were all very, very witty people, as having a very good time together. they, you know, what they have in common, it seems, is it's almost at the very end of this first essay, is that what they saw in common, and now the three guests didn't know about totalitarianism. They didn't know about everything is possible. What they did know was that the sky was darkening over them, in which the Platonic ideas, if you will, stood forth clearly before them. That they would have enjoyed, I believe, talking to each other about, even though Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche knew nothing about totalitarianism. The sky had not fallen, but it had darkened. And I believe that there is a joy in this essay that, to me, I can only liken it to one of Hannah's dinner parties, which she thoroughly enjoyed. And I don't know, there's something a bit amiss to me in treating this essay so terribly seriously. That's just a comment, Roger.
Well, it's a beautiful comment, Jerry. Thank you. I mean, I love the idea of this dinner party. I wish I were the wait staff. But you know, the serious part of it is that is your last line, right? Which is, it is a joy. In a way, it's a joyful essay, and yet I have tried to read it as a foreboding and essay about the sort of break in tradition and where that leaves us. But so all I can say to add, and I think to second your idea that it's joyful, and I just want this to be clear. This is a joyful book as a whole, even though this book is about this break in tradition, which breaks with totalitarianism, and that anything is possible, and it can be quite harrowing. And I think that many of these essays work in a way in which they seem like they're just so depressing and harrowing and the world is falling apart. But many of them end on a very positive, optimistic note. And that's actually, I think, the point, which is, or one of the points, which is that Arendt is saying for most of human history, the kind of joyful, playful exploration of the ways we can talk to each other and live with one another has been limited by authority and tradition. That had good things, right? It kept us from doing the worst, awful things, but it also had a bad side, which is that it limited us and kept us within certain guideposts. We're now free from those. And so like the last line of the or the last end of the What is Authority essay is that, as bad as things are, she says, to live in a political realm with neither authority nor the concomitant awareness that the source of authority transcends power, and those who are in power means to be confronted anew without the religious trust in a sacred beginning, so without authority, and without the protection of traditional and therefore self-evident standards of behavior, without tradition, by the elementary problems of human living together. And this being confronted anew with these elementary problems of living together is for her a kind of joy, is for her a kind of freedom. It can be terrifying, but there's also a joy in it. And so I very much appreciate your reminding us of the joy in it. So thank you. The sun is suddenly right in my eyes. Miriam.
Hi, Roger. I'm wondering if you could comment on this essay in relation to the American Constitution. When she talks about it on revolution as a exemplary founding of things. So I have two thoughts running through my head. Is that, being what it is, the Constitution is under constant amendment. Can you think of that as a kind of rolling tradition, or would a better image be, say, Melville's Moby Dick, where you take a ship named after a defunct indigenous tribe, fill it with all kinds of people, chase something impossible, and go down? I would like to get your sense of where you might sit between those two options.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. It's a great question. I mean, the Constitution, for her, is one of the things that makes the American Constitution great for her, is its lack of sovereignty and its embrace of what she calls the multiplication of powers through the Federalist tradition. But the other aspect of the Constitution, right, that makes it great, that is often less understood and less talked about, is that it, she says, to some degree, solve the problem of authority, of a new founding of tradition, which has been the greatest problem of the modern era. And it did so not by establishing, a new tradition, etc., but by creating a system through the Supreme Court, and she says this explicitly, that mimicked the Roman idea of aristocratic authority that was through the Senate and the senators. Just like in Rome, the senators would be nobles who would appeal back to the beginning and be able to say that we are representatives of the beginning.
Yeah.
She says that in the United States, the Supreme Court was 9 people who would be like a constant constitutional convention, and constantly rethinking the present in terms of the beginning. Yeah. So for her, the Constitution was not a group of words on the page, was not the original, language, right? But was the spirit of the beginning, the authority, and the Supreme Court was the body that was supposed to rethink our current situation within the spirit of the founding and the beginning. Yeah. So that's how I understand it.
And how do you think we're doing?
Well, I mean, look, that's obviously there's a lot of ways to answer that question. The extent that the Constitution is seen by many people today as a kind of written document of laws that's supposed to be interpreted either through language laws or through original construction or things like that. These are things she would find dangerous, and I think that we have. But I think the problem precedes Anton Scalia and originalism, because the problem is in her mind, or as I understand it, would be in her mind, that we are skeptical of the authority of 9 Supreme Court justices to embody the spirit of the Constitution. And so we force them to see the Constitution increasingly as a document to be interpreted logically and literally. And to the extent that we have moved in that direction and sort of seen the Constitution as simply a super law, we have lost the spirit of the founding and then lost the spirit of the constitutional tradition. So already in 1963, long before the idea of originalism has emerged, she argues that the focus on the Constitution as like a legal idea has endangered the American constitutional spirit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Lee Cooper.
Yeah. Thank you, Roger. Let me
Lee? Lee, I think you might have remuted yourself.
Okay, I'll be brief since there were 4 other people with questions behind me. I just wanted to say that Arendt, one line where she refers to the impact of the World War I on what followed and the break in tradition. She could very well have used the World War I, and particularly the British going into France and the trenches with the authority of God, king, and country, okay, that motivated them. That was completely gone as a result of the World War I experience. Similar to what happened in Russia with the 300-year reign of the Tsars. The authority of the Tsars evaporated, and that provided the groundwork for the Bolshevik Revolution. So Arendt, for the most part, doesn't really treat World War I in her and the impact of that in her writing. And this would have been this page would have been a good place to make reference to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. No, I think you're absolutely right. She does say that this is all that the event is a result of the aftermath of World War I, and she thinks that World War I certainly was in many ways the beginning of the end. She says more about that in parts of both the origins of totalitarianism, but also in I think it's the first or second speech in chapter in Responsibility and Judgment, where she talks about the loss of customs and the world after World War I. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think she would agree with you. So thank you. Dina.
Yeah, I was wondering, to what extent are we living in a tradition that recognizes that for some of us, tradition has no authority anymore? So to go back to Catherine's initial question, it started the discussion, the question, what is authority? Or what is tradition?
See you later.
Sorry. What is tradition? There is no such thing as one tradition. It's not Rome, it's not Judeo-Christian, it's not whatever. It claims a certain kind of authority. It claims the authority of saying that there's more than one tradition. We're not just that tradition or whatever tradition that is historically the controlling tradition is just the expression of an oppressive force, etc. these claims that we're making now about a broken tradition claim to have authority behind them. They claim to make an authoritative, they take an authoritative position, arguing that tradition is broken and no longer authoritative. So are we living in a tradition of that? Are we the grandchildren?
I don't think
of Marx and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others?
I mean, if we were, we'd be living in an Arendtian world, right? Where we all engaged in these kind of dinner party conversations and exercises and thinking that you and Jerry are talking about. I'm not sure Arendt has convinced the majority of the world that this is the way to live yet. Maybe she's convinced the 100 or so of you engaged in this discussion today. But I don't think we're yet living in a world in which Hannah Arendt is an authority.
But we're living in a world where many people question tradition as an authority.
Oh, I think we are living in a world in which many people now recognize the break in tradition. Yes.
Right.
As Catherine was saying before, there are some people who close their eyes to it or dig their head in the sand and want to reimpose the tradition, right? But I think, and there's some people who try and, use rhetoric or propaganda from the tradition to, pursue their interests. But I think many people do recognize that we're living in an extraordinary time. And there are different responses to it. So there's existentialism, of course, is one modern response to the break in tradition. In the sense that it's to say, what matters is not what you do, but just that you do it. And that anything in which you express your will is your truth. To some degree, the one unique American traditional response to it is pragmatism in a different way, which is simply to say there's no, let's not worry about a new tradition. Let's just try and muddle through. I mean, obviously it's more complicated than that, but in a sort of a vague way. And then there are people who simply want to, who say, well, I can do anything because there's no tradition and there's no limits or guideposts. And then there's people who are scared of that, and so they sort of hold on to the old guideposts. So I think, yes, I think we're living in that kind of world of the break, the gap between past and future, as she expresses it. And some people are terrified by it. Some people are oblivious to it. Some people are excited by it. Arendt says, look, there's a lot of dangers, but if we approach it in a thoughtful way, it can actually be very freeing, and we can see if we can build something new. But that relates to the question that someone just asked, I forget, about America and the possibility of, is there a possibility to found a new authority at a time after the break in tradition? And that's an open question. I mean, Arendt thought that the United States did succeed at a time in establishing a new authority. Now, this was in the 18th century, in the 19th century. But she thinks that has already been lost. That's the lost treasure of the revolutionary tradition. And I think she's skeptical but hopeful that such a new authority could be found and established. But that's one of the difficult questions in her work.
I'm just wondering, when does something become a tradition? As not so much
Well,
when
I
does it
mean,
become a thought. So
yeah,
at some point we will be a tradition. The being in the break will be a tradition.
maybe. I don't know. That's an interesting point. We may have to leave it at there. I see there's still some questions, but we're out of time, so I apologize about that. I tried to keep us going as quickly as possible, but we do have 7 more essays to read. And I hope you get a chance to ask our questions further as we go along. Thank you very much.